The Mercedes W04 is often forgotten about as one of the better cars of 2013, often being overshadowed by Sebastian Vettel's Red Bull RB9 after it took 9 back-to-back race wins. Knowing this, it's easy to forget just how good the W04 was in its own right despite its habit of eating tires, taking 3 race wins, 8 pole positions, and 2nd place in the championship for that year. Had Mercedes decided to dedicate all of their resources and efforts onto further developing the W04 throughout the 2013 season, then there's a good chance they would have been able to take more of a fight to Red Bull for the titles. But that's not how the story went, because shortly after the beginning of the season, the Brackley-based team would quickly put all of their efforts onto the car that was set to debut for the 2014 season after one of the biggest and most controversial regulation changes in Formula One history. The 2014 Mercedes W05 was nothing short of remarkable, especially considering all of the challenges faced by the team getting it to that point in the first place. Even when compared to some of the Mercedes Formula cars that would come later, such as the W06 in 2015, one of the most dominant cars in the sport's history, or the W11 in 2020, the fastest Formula One car of all time, the W05 was properly in a class of its own. Remember how the W04 won 3 races in 2013? Well, the W05 in 2014 would only lose 3 races, taking 18 pole positions and 12 front row lockouts. From the very start, it was clear that Mercedes had shown up with something special and that the rest of the teams were in real trouble. But just how good of a job Mercedes really had done was still a big question mark to all the other teams, and also to Mercedes themselves. At the 3rd race of the season in Bahrain, the true pace of the W05 would come to light for the first time. Mercedes chief designer John Owen said that this race was the first manifestation of the car's true performance, because prior to that, in the first 2 races, Mercedes had been very careful with the engine, going as far as to keep it out of any high power modes for fear of reliability. Along with this, the team hadn't even been pushing through the corners in the beginning of the season because of the tire issues that the team had carried over from 2013. And although they had made progress with the tires, Owen says that they weren't 100% sure that the problem had actually been solved. So while at the beginning of the season, the goal was simply just to finish the races in the first place, more on that later, and to gain an understanding of how these new cars and power plants operate, nobody, not even Mercedes chief engineers and designers, knew where they stood. Until Bahrain. Lewis and Nico were hammering it out for most of the race, but it wasn't until the late safety car that the field finally bunched up, and at the safety car restart at lap 46, we would see just how far ahead Mercedes really were. We have Sergio Perez in 3rd place at the restart, right behind the Mercedes. At the end of the first lap, he's 1.7 seconds off the lead. By the end of the 2nd lap, he's 4.4 seconds off the lead. And 10 laps later at the checkered flag, he's 24 seconds behind. Mercedes were scary fast. And Owen, including everybody else on the Mercedes pit wall, including engine guru Andy Cowell, who we'll talk about more later, couldn't believe what they were seeing. But how did they get to this point, especially considering that they didn't even have a running engine just a few months before the season started? They weren't sure that they were going to be able to finish the races in the first place. One of the big advantages that Mercedes had during the development of their 2014 package was that, unlike, for example, Red Bull, who had their engines supplied by Renault, the 2 Mercedes shops in charge of the chassis and the engine were close enough and worked in tandem to create a cohesive package under the Mercedes name. There was no fear of sharing and losing IP between different brands. One of the most notable examples of how this benefited Mercedes was the split turbo design that the Mercedes engines utilized, which in hindsight is brilliant but was risky at the time, as nothing like that had ever been done. The design allowed for lower intake temperatures and a much tighter engine package. And it wasn't the engine team that came up with it, it was the chassis team, because they were having a hard time figuring out how to make such a big and overweight engine fit into the car that they were trying to make. And so they went to the engine team and said, hey, what about a split turbo? That of course would go on to be one of Mercedes' big advantages in the power unit department. Mercedes were also very smart when it came to the way that they were managing their engine department, because they split it into 2 different groups, one whose sole purpose was performance and one whose sole purpose was reliability. So during the development of the V6, Mercedes had actually developed 2 different versions of the same engine that they would use for the season opener in Melbourne. One engine was built like a tank. It was 200 kilograms overweight. It was a big engine, and this engine was developed by the performance team so that they wouldn't have to worry about reliability. They could only focus on how to make power. So they built it like a tank so they didn't have to worry about the thing breaking when they were trying to run their tests. The other engine was the complete opposite. It was made to be very lightweight and fragile, and this was built for the reliability team to try and focus in on areas that needed work while leaving well enough alone in others. It would expose the weak links and show them where they needed to beef something up. And the final product, naturally, was just a combination of these 2 designs. And this all stems from a very good understanding of the unique challenges being presented by just how complicated these power units were. But, as prepared as they seemed to be, things weren't exactly going smoothly. During the summer of 2013, they were quickly approaching the deadline to send the engine details out to the Mercedes customer teams, obviously so they can build their cars, like Williams and McLaren. Andy Cowell said that they were less than 2 months out from this deadline, and they couldn't even put the engine on a dyno and produce a reliable power curve with it. It couldn't run for more than 50 kilometers on the dyno. It couldn't run without critical life support systems and would need a full rebuild after not even an hour. They weren't even close to being able to produce a race-ready engine, and they only had a few weeks until they had to not only run it themselves and finish it, but supply it to the other teams. Not to mention only a few months until preseason testing would begin in the beginning of 2014. It was almost the end of 2013, and they barely had a running engine. Right around the time of the British Grand Prix in 2013, there were a bunch of rumblings and rumors around the grid about how the Mercedes engine couldn't run on the dyno and how they wouldn't be ready in time. Not something you want if you're an engine manufacturer, and it was obviously a real concern, not just for Mercedes, but also for the customer teams whose performance relies solely on Mercedes delivering a strong package. And this problem is compounded by the fact that Mercedes now had to supply 8 different cars with their engines after signing Williams once they caught wind that McLaren was going to be leaving Mercedes for Honda in 2015. Again, this is an engine that couldn't run outside of the lab for more than a few minutes. You can imagine the pressure that Mercedes engineers and designers must have felt during this time. This was the situation that Mercedes found themselves in just months before preseason testing. Pressure is on, behind schedule, and still a lot of work that needed to be done, all while not knowing where the other teams like Red Bull and Ferrari stood in their development. But never once to back down from a fight, Mercedes management would have an emergency meeting in the end of 2013 where they would make the hard decision to switch their focus from winning the championship in 2014 to just being able to finish the races in the first place. Mercedes staff agreed to work an extra 10 hours a week. They were also redeployed to more critical areas, and it was all hands on deck in the engine development program. Bottom line is that they knew they were in trouble, and they didn't know if they were going to be able to make it work. It certainly wasn't looking good for the W05. Not only do they not have a running engine, but the chassis team doesn't have an engine to be able to build the car around. They were actually so concerned about how the reliability in Melbourne was going to be that they were worried that they were going to run out of spare engines and spare parts. Mercedes went into this new era of Formula One with no benchmark, with teams of hundreds of engineers and designers gritting their teeth every time a car pulled off the line or was leading a race. From engines overheating, crankcases blowing up, turbo shafts splitting in half, the engine being overweight and too bulky to ever be able to fit into a car in the first place, not to mention having to design an entire car around an engine that doesn't really exist, while making sure that the car conforms to the very complicated regulations coming in for 2014, the team had their work cut out for them, and in the latter stages of development in 2013 and early 2014, it really was anybody's game, and all Mercedes wanted to do at this point was to make it out of the races in one piece. Like I said, right now, the only thing Mercedes was worried about was making it to the finish line and being able to supply their customer teams with a reliable engine, something that they didn't have. But of course, they never dropped the ball. We know how this story goes. They regrouped and refocused and pushed on as hard as they could until the lights went out for that first FP1 session in Melbourne in 2014. And the rest is history, as the W05 would, of course, go on to be only a taste of what was to come as far as Mercedes dominance was concerned, as its successor, the W06 and then later the W07, would go on to be some of the most statistically dominant cars in Formula One history. Right up there with the McLaren MP4s and the Ferrari F2004s, or more recently the Red Bull RB19. But before these new cars ever even hit the grid in the beginning of the 2014 season for preseason testing, it was anybody's guess as to who was going to come out on top. Nobody knew how it was going to go, including Mercedes themselves. In hindsight, it's obvious, but back then,